So the second step that I recommend that you take is to take a look at the test case examples to note any similarities and differences in terms of the information that's provided, right? So if I scroll down here in the problem prompt, you'll see the following example. These are the example test cases that are provided. And if you ever want to consult, and I recommend doing so at the very beginning, before you write your code, additional test cases, remember that you can just type in here a space, and you'll see that this button becomes available, the option to run test cases. You may want to do this at the very beginning before writing code, as you'll be provided with all of the test case examples that'll be used to evaluate your solution. Of course, here you won't pass any, but now you do have the option of clicking on the hyperlink, test case 9 for instance, and here's an additional example. So we have this this set of input values that's provided by Mimr through the console. Here is the expected outputs for that particular test case. And then in terms of debugging, you might also find this window as being particularly helpful. So your code's output. So here, using this window, you can compare the actual output of your program as compared to the expected output given your test case to notice if there's any discrepancies, right? But what we're really looking for at this stage is the example test cases, just to see in terms of the inputs and the outputs if you can notice any similarities or differences. You'll notice, for example, here I have first name, last name, the code number for the item that I'm about to buy, as well as the item cost, and finally the cash amount. Okay, so you'll notice that these values are all somewhat different from the example test cases that are listed here, right? So in one case I have Eric Poitras, in another case I have Angela Siegel. The type of information, though, is still somewhat similar in that if you take a look at some of the highlighted similarities, for example, so I've included this in my notes. So if you're using pen and paper, I recommend to just draw down a few example test cases and just to kind of, note all of these similar pieces of information, as they can be very helpful to kind of narrow it down. So for instance, here I've highlighted Eric as the first name. Notice how it appears out of order in terms of the output. So that might be a clue in terms of thinking, well, I might want to capture the first name differently from the last name, and then store that information in separate variables, as I'll likely need to invert the order of each of these strings at a later step, right? So here we have our ID, shows up here, 8.50 and then 10.0, all showing up on separate lines in the output. So across the test cases, still the same type of information. You'll notice in the first case here, Angela, a different value than Eric as in the first name, but still a string that you can capture via the same variable. Siegel as the last name also appears out of order, and then again, the ID from the item that I'm about to buy, 5.0 being the cost of the item, and then 10.0 being the cash amount. Another detail that's important to notice is all the little spaces in between these values, which will provide some important clues in terms of concatenating the strings when you format your output, right? So notice that here there's a space in between Eric and Poitras. There's a space here between column and the last name. So all these little details matter. Also note the number of decimal points behind the floating point numbers, as in 8.50. So any discrepancy between your program's actual output and the expected output as stated in the test case will make your test case fails when you evaluate your solutions in Mimr. So it's very important to note down all these little relevant details.